Today's Tips du Jour mailbag question comes to us from Ireland. Robert, I'm interested in knowing the pros and cons of multi-scale instruments. Can you offer any advice? Dave in Ireland. Well, Dave, fan frets is the common name for that, or multi-scale fretboards, have been around for a number of years. There's examples dating all the way back to the Renaissance period, so it's nothing new. Now, traditionally, longer scale lengths produce your lower frequencies, shorter scale lengths produce your higher frequencies. Let's take the brass family, for example. Tubas, large, wide, and long tubing, produces the lower response, and the trumpet, for example, has narrower tubing and less of it, and therefore produces the high-end response. Now, traditionally on guitars, we've tried to cram all of those 6 strings, which have different tensions and different thicknesses, into one scale length. Because of this, your higher end can become brittle, and your lower end can be floppy or muddy. This is especially true on instruments that have more than 6 strings, 7, 8, 9, 10-string guitars. Imagine a piano or even a harp with one scale length. Because of all the different tensions of strings, you need to have multi-scales on those instruments. So that's kind of the reasoning or the theory behind using multi-scales or fan frets. Now, I'm on my way to Fort Collins, Colorado. A good buddy of mine up there and fellow luthier, Michael Baskin, does quite a few of these fan frets or multi-scales. Let's go see what he has to say about it.
All right, so here we are in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm in the shop of Michael Baskin, guitar building extraordinaire, and he does a lot of multi-scales and fan frets and stuff. So I thought I'd come right to the source and ask him what are the advantages and some of the disadvantages, if there are any, of using a multi-scale or a fan fret.
All right. Well, it's a good question. A lot of customers ask me that. And the advantages, I think, are that you're putting a tension gradient along the strings of the guitar. So you have more tension on the bass, less tension on the treble. That does a couple things. One of the things it does is for players who like to do a lot of alternate or drop tunings, you get more tension on the bass strings, so they stay crisp, they don't get flabby, and I think they have they just sound better. And at the same time, on the high end, because you have less tension, get a little bit of a sweeter tone, a little bit more warmth, a little bit more overtone content. So by putting a tension gradient on the strings, you're imposing a sort of an acoustic effect on the guitar. The other thing that it does is you're matching the scale length of the string to the notes that that string is expected to produce.
Right.
So, for example, if you think of a piano, the bass strings on a piano are much, much longer than the treble strings on a piano.
Right.
Why is that? It's because shorter strings, they produce higher frequencies, they don't need the same length. And if you were to ask a very long string to produce a very high frequency, it just doesn't sound as good. So you're kind of matching the string length to the frequencies that the string is expected to produce, and you get a certain, some people feel an improvement in the sonority of the notes. So to me, those are the advantages. There's one other, a little bit more subtle. You could see it as an advantage or maybe a disadvantage, depending on your taste. But if you think about your right-hand position on the guitar and the bridge is slanted relative to that, your thumb or your bass strings are farther away from the bridge than the treble strings.
Right.
So again, you're kind of putting an acoustic effect by changing where your right-hand position is relative to the angle of the saddle. And so to me, those are pretty much the advantages of it. These aren't disadvantages, but some things that multi-scales don't do is I don't see any improvement in intonation.
Okay.
For me and most of my customers, I don't find that there's really any big ergonomic advantage or disadvantage. It depends where you are on the neck. If you're playing a bar F chord down at the nut, I think of it as a slight ergonomic disadvantage because you have to tilt your wrist this way. Whereas if you're playing up high in the neck, it's almost like the frets are angling into your hand.
Right.
Those effects are slight, but it also depends on how much fan or multi-scale you have, and that's just up to the builder. I typically do about a 3/4 inch offset between the low E and the high E string.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Have you found an optimum scale length for what you do? For example, what would be the distance or the length on the first string? What would be the length on the sixth string? Or does it matter?
There is no one optimum. It depends what you're trying to do with the guitar. If I have a customer who tells me that they play in a C tuning,
right,
I'm probably going to push the scale lengths longer. Whereas if somebody tells me they mostly play in standard or drop D, I don't think they need to be as long.
Right.
So that's a kind of a individual case as to what's best.
Good. All right. Disadvantage as far as when you're building the guitar. Obviously, it's going to complicate things quite a bit for the luthier.
Yeah, it takes more time to build a multi-scale guitar. There are some other things you need to compensate for, like the angle of the headstock coming off a nut that ends at two different points.
Right.
Of course, cutting the fretboard takes more time, more precision in the layout. And then finally, one of the things that you can't see from the outside of the guitar, but it does change the bracing a bit, because if things are no longer symmetrical,
right,
and if you want the wings of the bridge to hit or at some point intersect the X braces, right, everything's kind of tilted and splayed and becomes asymmetrical. There are different ways of handling it. I can tell you how I handle it is I actually move the X brace slightly off center,
right,
and make the X brace slightly asymmetrical.
So there's a lot to this, guys. Is there a marketing advantage?
Yeah, there's definitely a cool factor. It's fan fret guitars, multi scales, same thing. But that's really been the domain of custom makers for the last 20 years, and now it's starting to come out on production instruments.
Right.
And so what was once solely the realm of custom instruments, I think, is becoming less unique, but.
Right.
A lot of people want one because they don't have one,
right?
And they have multiple guitars.
So it could be a cool marketing factor.
Yeah, I think there's some of that.
What percentage of your guitars leave your shop with the multi-scales? Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And I can answer your question. I'd say it's probably about 35%.
Really? So a pretty high number. Pretty high number.
Yeah. They're multi-scales are more popular with the fingerstyle crowd. You don't see them on too many bluegrass pickers.
Right.
But most of my clients are fingerstyle players, so I think that's why they've been popular with my guitars.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Robbie.
Appreciate the information, and I hope that answered your question.
So Dave in Ireland, I hope you have found this information useful. Now, on a 6-string guitar, we've been playing them for years and years and years in the same scale length, and it works. If you go to a 7 or 8 or even 9-string, you probably ought to consider doing the multi-scale. And if you just want to tinker around and have some fun, try it on a 6-string. And happy building.